So first thing to do will be make a panel big enough for the cutting board I want. I've got some S4S maple, so it's surface on all sides. So real quick, I'm just gonna throw this together into a panel, nothing you haven't seen before. Okay, I've got my maple panel and I want to do an inlay in it. I've got this bloodwood that is going to contrast really nicely, and I've got the Shark SD100 CNC that Woodcraft was kind enough to send me. However, I've never used it before except for practicing. I did one practice piece here to figure out how to do an inlay since I've never done it before, just like I do a test cut on any piece of equipment first. And there are a few errors, so I'm going to try to correct those, make sure I've got my process down, and then I can do it on the real deal. All right, on my second test with the actual test, I'm going to be engraving. It went a lot better. Still a few mistakes, like I went off the edge of the board. It's because I was trying to avoid this knot, and I was like, whatever, because it's just a test. Yeah, fits together nicely. I want to talk about a few details here, though. So what's the deal with the V-Carve? Well, the CNC router, of course, is using round router bits. Now on the outside profiles, it's really easy to do a sharp corner because it just changes direction and you get a squared off corner. On internal structures though, it's going to have a radius. Now with a V-bit that has this point, it's possible to machine one that doesn't have a radius, but the way you have to do that is in these corners, you have to change the Z-axis, the up, and cut up and out of that corner. Then that's how you get these crisp corners. And that's a special feature in some software, and that's what the actual V-Carve is. V-Carve isn't just carving with a V-bit, it's the software knowing to go up on your corners like that to give you crisp edges, so that way they actually fit together. Because if this was crisp and this was not, then we'd be mashing material trying to put them together. And I had some learning points on this project. You can see I had some blowout here and here. That was a result of my roughing pass. My end mill that was doing the roughing was just going too fast, too aggressive for this pine, and I wasn't thinking about how weak the grain was for when it went this way and it just grabbed that piece and tore it. So I think the answer is when I do the maple, this is just a lot denser wood, so it probably won't be much of an issue, but I need to go a little bit slower considering that I'm moving with the grain on a lot of these passes, and that should fix that. The other thing that was kind of weird is you can see this line I have here, and that's because after I did the roughing pass, when my V-bit came through, it did this S just fine, and then it came up to move, but it didn't move all the way over to the R, and it started doing the R shape here right on top of the S. I'm not sure why the machine missed steps or what the real culprit was here, but what I was able to do is measure the distance between where it did cut and where it was supposed to cut, and then I re-zeroed my machine because when I told it to go home it went like here, but it should have gone here, and I was able to use that distance to re-zero the machine properly, and actually reran the rest of this just by rerunning the program, and was able to line it up pretty well, and it ran fine the second time. So I don't know what the deal was with the first go, why I did that. This is my first CNC project, so I'm not going to go deep down the rabbit hole of fixturing and all the software settings because I'm still learning it myself. But there's a few things that even with the tutorials I watched was a sticking point for me that took me a while to work through, and I want to explain that to hopefully help you get ahead of the curve. Now, I'm using V-Carve Desktop because that's what came with the Shark SD100 that Woodcraft was kind enough to send me to work with, and it has a setting for doing inlays, and when you select select that, you can then choose to do the pocket or the plug, and it automates a lot of that process for you. But what I learned, I think, is that it doesn't do V-carves. So if you want to do a V-carve to get that crisp corner like I talked about, you need to use the V-carve and then trick the machine a little bit to get it to do the pocket and plug, which is pretty easy. And here's the little trick we need in order to differentiate between the pocket and the plug. Now the software likes to draw between graphics, and it starts with the outermost vector. So when we did the pocket, we just had the text and it would go between these. Now that we want to do the plug, I drew a box around it. Now it's going to start here and go to there, and it'll remove all of the material around the letters and leave the letters. Hope that makes sense. And this is the part that tripped me up, is the explanations on the start depth and flat depth. So the start depth and flat depth are actually pretty easy once it clicked for me, but it took a minute. There's this illustration a lot of folks like to use that I've seen, but there are too many lines and it just didn't click for me. But there's, you know, our plug. Of course, because the bit is V-shaped, the sides are sloped. Now, as we go up or down the height on this, the size of the letter is going to change because it slopes out, so it gets bigger. Let's jump over to the pocket. Now, the start depth is the depth at which, you know, on that slope, the image looks the same as what we have on the screen, what we want. Because if you go above or below that, the text is going to be smaller or larger than what you picked because of that angle. So when we do our pocket, the start depth is 0 because we want this to be exactly the same. Now, if you're going to be sanding, you might offset this and make it a little bit higher so after you sand it down, but this graphic isn't that picky because it's just some text, it's block letters. If you had a really fancy logo or something with a lot of detail, you might want to add a few thousandths to account for the fact you'd be sanding it smooth afterwards. But anyway, that's the start depth. Now the flat depth on the pocket is just the depth. It's how deep we're doing the letters to get to the flat part, the flat. So hence flat depth. Where it gets a little tricky is when we start talking about the plug, because this plug, of course, is going to fit in there and the pocket is angled in. So what I'm seeing here, the surface of this is smaller text than what I want it to end up looking like. It has to be smaller in order to fit down there and get in that pocket. When you pick start depth, what you're deciding is basically how much penetration your plug is going to have. So since I went 0.15 on my flat depth here, so I have a 0.15 inch deep pocket, I went 0.1 on this. That leaves me 0.05 inches or 50 thousandths of an inch glue room. Because if I didn't leave any room for glue to kind of settle and have some space to go, then I'm probably going to get a hydraulic lock and not be able to get this as deep as I wanted, then have glue lines. The flat depth then is how much protrusion you have. So just remember on your pocket, you want the surface to be 0 unless you're trying to leave room for sanding, and then so that's your start depth, and then the flat depth will just be however deep you want. Then when you do your plug, you want the start depth to be a little less than the flat depth to give room for glue, and the start depth is basically the amount of penetration you have, and then your flat depth is how much, can't think of a good word for this, offset, rise, gap, there you go, the gap is how much gap you're going to have is what your flat depth is. Now because the board is pretty much as wide as the table, I'm going to use blue tape and CA glue to secure it, because obviously my clamps aren't going to be any help here. Here's one of those little things I learned during one of my first test cuts. Because of the way this machine's made, this is the rearmost limit on its cut. So even though there's, you know, 4 or 5 more inches of bed, it doesn't cut there. So I've made a mark so I now know how far back I can cut, because this doesn't have limit switches, so it won't stop itself if you try to make it go too far. So to make sure I'm in the cuttable area, I have 13 inches of cut in the y-axis here. My graphic is 10.5. So what I did is made a mark in the middle of the board, which is where I want the middle of the graphic, and the graphic is referenced off the middle of the graphic when I designed it. So if I set the middle of this board to the origin 0, 0 on the machine, then the graphic is going to be centered on it. If it's off a little bit, this board is like 3 inches long, so I can trim it to account for that. Now, and I made sure that the middle of the board when I set it is approximately in the middle of the cutting area, so I've got some fudge on both directions on the y-axis, so I shouldn't run into any limit issues. But yeah, making sure the work is in the usable space of the machine is important, I learned. And the first tool I'll probably actually use is an end mill, but I still have my V-bit in here, so to set my origin I'll use my V-bit because this point is easier to identify than, you know, the middle of this thing. 0x, 0y, 0, 0. All right, X marks the spot. That looks pretty good. Now I'm gonna have to reset the height because this bit is taller, but at least my X and Y are correct now. For the 1/4 inch over the 1/8 inch on the actual one because it went from 1.5 to 2.5 inches, and the 1/4 inch was going to save me a good bit of time. But when I was cutting this, I'd also slowed it down because I had the chip out issues, but the 1/4 inch seemed to be going really fast, and the letters weren't as big as I thought they were supposed to be. Then when I put in the V-bit, it was cutting area that was already cut, and I couldn't figure out what was going on. Checked a bunch of things and it hit me. I left my file names the same but put them in different folders, so when I loaded the files to do the real one, I didn't change folders and I ran the test file on my real piece. So I've got a new thing glued up. I'm going to run it through the planer, throw it on here, and get it caught up. What a bonehead mistake. So second-ish attempt, sort of got the pocket done without incident, I think. I've already cleaned up these letters, but on these you can see that on this side of it, there's this line that almost seems like it should have got cut but didn't. On this side, not the case. Also, this side seems a little steeper than this side, like, I don't know, maybe it missed steps and just got shifted a little bit. Talked to a friend, he said could be grain direction, but based on how much, I don't think that's it, or tramming, which is basically making sure the machine is, you know, actually vertical and everything is square like it should be. Fortunately, it's just a tiny bit and a little bit of chisel work seems to scoop it right up. Alright, so pocket cut, time to cut the plug. That's the actual inlay out of this blood heart, but not sure if you can see. It's actually got a little bit of a cup and it's slightly wavy just because it's so thin and it's sat. Now this is smaller than I really want to run through my big machines, so what I'm going to do is glue it with the bow up because the super glue helped fill the little bit of a gap, and then I'll just flatten it manually with the CNC so that way it's true to the surface and go from there. As you saw, I used the kind of fat bit to sift through, and this is flat to the bed and router, etc. I've got my 1/4 inch bit in here. I'm actually going to do a 1/4 inch, an 1/8 inch, and then the V bit on the plug. Because I'm going to have to hog off so much material, 1/4 inch bit will be a lot faster than the 1/8 inch bit. Will save me a lot of time with the V bit because it'll be able to get between the letters more, and of course the V bit to do the walls. Just waiting on the battery to charge and throw that in the router and get this going, and then this thing will be almost done. or at least the CNC work. All right, I think I finally got there off camera. I just, cut this free, and I think it missed steps again. When I did the V-bit, there was a big chunk I had to chisel off all the bottom sides, and didn't quite seem to go right. But I think I know what the culprit was. I think I missed steps during my own screw up with the Z-axis. So following the manufacturer's advice, I set this so that the bottom of the router collet was about 1 inch from the wasteboard. But these V-bits are tiny and this was thin material. And with the router there, what happened is I was able to get my 0 at the top of the surface, but when it tried to plunge down the 0.2 inches, so almost 1/4 inch, I was actually bottoming out before it got there, and that was causing some issues, and I'd let it ran a bit before I noticed that, and then I had to loosen the router and push the whole router down so I could get more room on the Z-axis. And I think in the process of doing that is where I lost a few steps on the X-axis. It looked like it was still in the right place, but it was off like, I don't know, a 64th, maybe even less than that. But I think it feels like it still fits in there okay, because fortunately with that taper and the fact that this is only meant to go halfway down into that, then the rest is that gap. Remember, the start depth versus the flat depth, the penetration versus the gap. It should still line up okay. So time to glue it up and we'll see. Dried and it's looking good. I'm going to go ahead and take this to the bandsaw to remove most of the material, but if I was feeling frisky, I could just mount it back to the CNC and use that flattening bit to remove most of it and then sand it. So if you don't have a big bandsaw, or handsaw would work, or you could sand it away if you're a masochist. Anyway, bandsaw for me. This is looking good. Now, I didn't unplug the vacuum on my Mirka just to show off how awesome it works, which is awesome, or to get COPD faster. But because I had that V-bit alignment issue, I had a feeling there might be some hairline cracks, and there are, so this is gonna help me make those disappear, I think. I hope. We'll see. Almost there. Off camera, I went through the grits, finished at 220, and popped it with water in between, so that way first time this gets washed, it doesn't get all fuzzy. I'm going to use Mahoney's walnut oil. I like this because it's a polymerized oil, or heat-treated oil, which means it will polymerize, turn into a solid. I did a whole video on food-safe finishes and epoxy and cutting boards and all that. I'll leave a card and link below if you're interested, but let's get to the fun stuff. So this was quite the learning process, but I'm really happy with how it came out, and I learned a lot, which is great. I've been wanting to mess with CNC for quite a while, but I knew there'd be a big learning curve, and that's put me off some. But when Woodcraft offered to send me that machine, I was like, you know what, time to dive into it. And I think I'm gonna get some big machines soon, some bigger ones. So look forward to that. And if you want me to try to do a deep dive on V-Carve and really get into all the details of how to do the V-Carve inlays, let me know, and I might do that if there's enough interest. Anyway, I hope you learned something, were inspired, or at least entertained. And until next time, make time to make something.